She was young, experienced, and trusted by the orcas she worked beside. But on July 8th, during a routine session at SeaWorld San Diego, everything went wrong. Two killer whales, Orkid and Splash, dragged trainer Tamarie Tollison beneath the surface. What happened in that pool was nearly fatal, and what followed raised even more disturbing questions. This is the story SeaWorld never wanted you to hear. Welcome to Animal Quest channel, where we uncover the truth behind the world's most shocking animal attacks. If this is your kind of story, subscribe, like, and share to support more documentaries like this. Wait, before we start, who is Tamarie? Tamarie Tollison was 28 years old and already a seasoned veteran at SeaWorld San Diego. As a senior orca trainer, she was trusted, respected, and deeply admired by her colleagues. She had spent years at Shamu Stadium, training, performing, and bonding with the very whales the public came from all over the world to see. To most visitors, the orcas were awe-inspiring creatures, massive, unpredictable, and distant. But to Tamarie, they were so much more. She spoke to them like close companions. She had spent countless hours learning their behaviors, understanding their moods, and building trust that few people on Earth could ever claim. Especially with Orkid and Splash, two whales she worked with nearly every day. Orkid, born at SeaWorld in 1988, was one of the most experienced whales in the park. Intelligent, quick to learn, but also known for moments of assertiveness. Splash, a male orca transferred from SeaWorld San Antonio, was known for his size and power. An impressive animal, but one with a complicated training history. Tamarie had grown close to both of them. She didn't fear them. She respected them. Staff often described Tamarie as calm, confident, and in control. A model trainer. She was the kind of person who believed in the bond between human and animal. She believed trust was earned, and she believed the whales trusted her back. But behind the smiles and show routines, there were murmurs, quiet warnings shared in break rooms and locker hallways. Trainers had whispered concerns about Orkid's behavior before. There had been incidents, nothing fatal, nothing public, but moments when she tested boundaries. Tamarie knew the risks, everyone in that stadium did, but she also believed in what she was doing. She believed in the whales, and that morning, July 8th, 2002, was supposed to be like any other. But was something already off? Could anyone have seen what was about to happen? Because just hours later, that same stadium would fall silent, and Tamarie Tollison would be fighting for her life beneath the surface. It was Monday morning, July 8th, 2002, and the sun rose bright over SeaWorld San Diego. The air was warm, the park quiet before the gates opened, and behind the scenes, preparations were already underway for the first show of the day at Shamu Stadium. For Tamarie Tollison, it was just another shift. She arrived early, walked the same concrete path she always did, nodded to colleagues setting up for the mid-morning crowd. Everything felt routine, familiar. Inside the back pools of Shamu Stadium, Orkid and Splash swam in wide circles, cutting through the water with effortless grace. Tamarie had worked with both whales extensively. She knew their behaviors, their signals, their quirks. Today's session would involve basic reinforcement. No live audience yet, just pre-show conditioning, bond building, and trust work. Orkid was now 14 years old, a dominant female orca born in captivity, smart, responsive, but known internally for having a stubborn streak. She had once grabbed a trainer's ponytail and yanked hard. No injuries, no press. Just a reminder of how quickly these 5,000-pound animals could change the script. Splash, larger and slower, was gentler by comparison. Though his transfer from Texas in 1992 came with warnings of his own. Unpredictable energy, sometimes slow to respond to signals. But today, both whales were calm, engaged, curious. Tamarie entered the water just like she had hundreds of times before. No tension, no hesitation. From the deck, trainers monitored the session, radios at their hips, cue boards in hand. It was a controlled environment, a safe routine. But routines can be deceiving, because while Tamarie smiled and began vocal cues, While Orchid circled closer and Splash swam beneath the surface, something began to shift. It wasn't obvious at first. No aggression, no warning sounds, just subtle changes, movement, posture, gaze that only experienced eyes might notice. But even then, would it have made a difference? In less than 5 minutes, that calm, routine session would spiral into chaos. Tamarie Tollison had trained for years to work with killer whales, but nothing could prepare her for what was about to happen next. Tamarie floated beside Orchid, offering gentle vocal cues and hand signals. The massive whale responded, circling slowly in front of her, surfacing with a familiar exhale of mist. From the deck above, the atmosphere remained calm. It was a routine Tamarie had done countless times in the clear, chlorinated depths of Shamu Stadium. But in an instant, everything changed. Without warning, Orchid turned, not with aggression, but with a sudden, decisive motion, and clamped her powerful jaws around Tamarie's foot. There was no time to react. One moment, Tamarie was upright, centered in the water. The next, she was yanked downward by an animal weighing over 5,000 pounds. The radio crackled. A trainer on deck shouted. And then, Splash joined in. The second orca surged forward from below, his massive frame cutting through the water like a torpedo. Now both whales were involved, each pulling her in different directions. Tamarie's body twisted under the surface, dragged deeper and deeper. From above, her fellow trainers could barely track her shadow beneath the rippling blue. Panic spread across the pool deck. "Recall! Recall!" someone shouted, activating emergency signals, hoping the whales would respond to the routine they'd practiced. But they didn't let go. Tamarie struggled, trying to break free, trying to push away, but she was completely outmatched. The water muffled everything. Shouts, alarms, her own screams. Down below, all she could see was black and gray muscle. Her oxygen started to vanish. Her limbs flailed. She tried to reach the surface. Nothing. Deck trainers scrambled for distraction tools, buzzers, slaps, food lures, anything that might break the orca's grip. But the pool had become a whirlpool of chaos. For 30 agonizing seconds, Tamarie Tollison vanished beneath the surface of SeaWorld's most iconic pool. And for those 30 seconds, it looked like she wasn't coming back. But how did it stop? What made the whales let go? And would Tamarie survive what happened next? That answer would come, but only after one of the most terrifying moments in SeaWorld history. Below the surface of Shamu Stadium, Tamarie Tollison was running out of time. The two whales, Orkid and Splash, still had hold of her foot, her body, her future. Then a critical decision was made. From the pool deck, a senior trainer, eyes locked on the chaos unfolding below, reached for one of the last tools available, a false signal. They gave the call for Kasatka, the dominant matriarch orca, known for commanding the social hierarchy of the pool. But Kasatka wasn't actually present. It was a psychological cue, a sound, a routine, something the whales had been conditioned to associate with submission, with obedience, with yielding. The moment the signal rang out, something shifted. Orchid broke contact first, then Splash. Suddenly, Tamarie's body bobbed to the surface, limp, twisted, and motionless for a few seconds before her arms moved. She gasped, coughing, eyes wide and unfocused. She was alive, but barely. Trainers rushed in with stretchers and boards, yanking her from the water as fast as possible. As they lifted her from the pool, the full extent of the damage became clear. Her arm shattered, a compound fracture, bone protruding through skin. Her foot was mangled. Bruises and bite marks ran across her torso. And through it all, she remained conscious, barely able to speak, but alert enough to register the panic around her. Guests near the backstage area froze, watching from behind safety rails. Some would later say they didn't understand what they were witnessing. Others said they'd never forget the blood on the concrete as Tamarie was rushed through the service gate toward emergency medical care. But while she was finally free from the water, the danger wasn't over. Her body had survived, but the consequences were only just beginning. Would she ever walk again? Would she ever return to the water? And what would SeaWorld do next? Because in the aftermath of the attack, the questions would only get darker. Tamarie Tollison was rushed from SeaWorld San Diego to a nearby hospital with multiple traumatic injuries. A compound fracture in her forearm, torn ligaments, deep bruising, and lacerations from the orca's jaws. She had survived, but she was in no condition to speak. Inside the emergency room, doctors worked to stabilize her. Pins were inserted to set the bone. The medical team fought to preserve full use of her arm. Her foot was bandaged. She was sedated in pain and drifting in and out of consciousness. But while Tamarie lay in a hospital bed, another battle was already unfolding, one she would have no control over. Inside SeaWorld's management offices, the conversation shifted from "what happened" to "what do we say?" According to public reports, internal meetings quickly focused on damage control. The language used to describe the incident became critical. Was this an animal aggression incident? Or was it, as some executives quietly suggested, a trainer positioning error? It was a familiar tactic, one used in previous incidents at marine parks around the country. Shift blame, minimize the optics, protect the brand. Because in a facility that prided itself on the harmony between human and whale, an attack like this could be catastrophic, both for public relations and regulatory oversight. Official statements were carefully worded. The public was told the trainer suffered an injury during a routine training session. No mention of being dragged underwater, no acknowledgement that 2 whales were involved, and certainly no word on the emergency recall signal that saved her life. Behind the polished smiles and tightly controlled press releases, the truth was being scrubbed clean. But why? Was this about Tamarie's safety or the park's image? And if it had happened before, how many other incidents never made it to the public? Because while Tamarie was still recovering, SeaWorld was already moving to bury the story. But the warning signs? They had been there all along. As the days passed after the attack, Tamarie Tollison remained in recovery, her injuries serious, her future uncertain. But outside the hospital, a very different picture was forming, because whispers began to surface. This wasn't the first time Orchid had shown aggression toward trainers. Records later revealed that Orchid, the female orca born at SeaWorld in 1988, had a troubling track record. In 1996, she grabbed a trainer by the ponytail, dragging them into the water. There were no major injuries that time, but the message was clear. She was strong, dominant, and not always compliant. And that wasn't the only incident. Internal reports, later made public, detailed multiple behavioral red flags involving both Orkid and Splash. Incidents where whales didn't respond to cues, acted unpredictably, or showed signs of irritation during routine sessions. These weren't rare occurrences. They were documented patterns. Whistleblowers, speaking years later, described a culture of pressure where voicing safety concerns often meant risking your position. Trainers who raised flags about waterwork were quietly reassigned or ignored. The show had to go on. The illusion had to stay intact. Even more damning, internal memos reportedly flagged both Orkid and Splash as high-risk animals for in-water interactions. These weren't just difficult whales. They were known liabilities, but they remained in rotation, and Tamarie was sent into the water anyway. Was it overconfidence, negligence, or something worse? Because what happened to Tamarie Tollison wasn't just an accident. It was the latest chapter in a long list of near misses that had been building for years. She wasn't the first trainer to be pulled under by an orca, but she was the one who lived to talk about it. And now her survival was forcing SeaWorld to answer questions they had avoided for far too long. Tamarie Tollison's road to recovery began the moment she left the operating room at a San Diego trauma center. Doctors had worked for hours to repair the compound fracture in her arm, stabilize nerve damage, and begin the long process of healing both bone and tissue. Pins were inserted, ligaments were stitched, but the damage ran deeper than anyone could see. Over the following weeks, she entered intensive physical rehabilitation, learning to use her arm again, regaining strength in her leg, and trying to process the trauma that had nearly killed her. What had once been second nature, swimming, diving, trusting, now carried the weight of memory and pain. She didn't speak publicly. She didn't appear in interviews. And quietly, without announcement or farewell, Tamarie Tollison never returned to waterwork with orcas again. Those who worked beside her at SeaWorld San Diego never forgot what they saw that day. Off camera, some trainers admitted it changed everything for them. One later said, "We all knew it could have been worse, and that scared us." Another recalled watching her pulled out of the water, limp and bloodied, and thinking, "That could have been any one of us." But while her body began to heal, her life was never the same. Because how do you return to the water when the animals you once called family nearly ended your life? And perhaps more haunting, what do you do when the world moves on, but you're still living with the silence? Tamarie never gave a public statement, no interviews, no memoir, no media tour, but her absence said everything. Still, the whales remained in the stadium. The shows went on, and deep below the surface, questions still swirled. Questions that SeaWorld had yet to answer, because the story wasn't over. Not yet. While Tamarie Tollison disappeared quietly from the spotlight, the whales at the center of the incident, Orkid and Splash, remained right where they were. Orkid, the same orca who had clamped her jaws around Tamarie's foot and dragged her underwater, continued performing at SeaWorld San Diego. Her name stayed on show schedules. Her routines were adjusted, but her presence never wavered. To the public, she was just another star of the Shamu show. Strong, graceful, obedient. But insiders knew otherwise. Behind the scenes, internal documents, later surfaced through public records and media investigations, revealed something else. SeaWorld kept Orkid in rotation despite repeated behavioral warnings. She had been involved in multiple incidents prior to July 2002. The attack on Tamarie was the most serious, but it wasn't isolated. And yet, no formal announcement was made. No press release, no indication to the public that a trainer had nearly died. Splash, her poolmate that morning, and the second whale involved in the attack, continued training for several more years. Eventually, he was retired from water work, but not due to disciplinary action. Instead, it was attributed to age and health issues. His involvement in the Tamarie incident was never highlighted publicly. The official statement SeaWorld issued in the days after the attack described the event as a training-related accident. The words were careful, practiced, and vague. There was no mention of aggression, no mention of recall signals, no mention of both whales dragging a senior trainer beneath the surface for nearly half a minute. The public was told simply that nothing unusual occurred. But inside the training rooms, behind the stadium walls, everything had changed. Whales that once inspired wonder now carried a shadow. Trainers grew more cautious, and the unspoken fear, what if it happens again, never fully left the pool. The orcas remained, the shows went on, but the illusion of safety, that was gone, and Tamarie's silence only deepened the mystery. Because if the whales were still performing, and the trainer had vanished, what was SeaWorld trying to protect? And what was the cost of keeping it quiet? In the days following the attack at SeaWorld San Diego, a brief segment aired on local news. A trainer had been injured during a routine session, the report said, treated and recovering. There were no images of the scene, no interviews with those involved, and no mention of the orcas by name. The message was tightly controlled. SeaWorld's corporate team moved fast to shape the narrative. Internally, employees were reminded of their non-disclosure agreements, documents that barred trainers and staff from discussing internal incidents with the media. Any questions about the attack were met with a familiar answer. We do not comment on internal safety matters. But even as the story faded from public headlines, it didn't disappear. Years later, as criticism of marine mammal captivity began to build, Tamarie Tollison's attack resurfaced, quietly but powerfully. When the 2013 documentary Blackfish exposed the psychological toll of captivity on orcas and the dangers trainers faced, Tamarie's name appeared. Her story, though never spoken by her directly, was part of the case study. Not because she went public, she never did, but because what happened to her had been buried too cleanly. Filmmakers and journalists used public documents, behavior logs, and trainer testimony to piece together a pattern, one that extended beyond a single incident. Tamarie Tollison's near-death experience was not an outlier. It was part of a long, painful history of SeaWorld trainers being placed in dangerous situations and told to smile through it. Her silence spoke volumes. She didn't give interviews. She didn't return to the spotlight. But her absence from the stage, her name in the training logs, her injuries that day in July 2002, they helped awaken a movement. Because behind every orca trick, behind every smiling trainer, was a risk no one wanted to talk about. Until now. And Tamarie's story, whether she meant it to or not, forced people to start asking, what else has been hidden? And how many more stories like hers have yet to surface? The attack on July 8, 2002, nearly took Tamarie Tollison's life. But in the years that followed, her survival would quietly shape an industry. At first, nothing changed, at least not publicly. Orchid remained in shows. Splash was still in the water. Tamarie's story faded into shadows, but behind the scenes, the cracks had started forming. Then came February 2010. Another senior trainer, Dawn Bronchot, was killed by the Orca Tillison at SeaWorld Orlando, in front of a live audience. This time, the story couldn't be buried. The public outcry was immediate. The headlines were inescapable, and the scrutiny was intense. Only then did federal regulators step in, forcing sweeping changes. SeaWorld was ordered to revise its safety procedures. Water work with orcas was permanently restricted. Trainers were no longer allowed to enter the pool during shows. Protocols were rewritten, platforms were raised, barriers were added. The risk had finally become impossible to ignore. And while Tamarie Tollison never returned to the water, her story lingered behind those changes. She had been pulled under. She had been silenced. But her name remained in every internal report, every risk assessment, every closed-door meeting that followed. To some, she became a symbol of survival. To others, a shocking reminder of how close the system had come to failing her completely. Because she wasn't the last, and she wasn't the first. But her survival became a warning. One that no one could ignore anymore, and one that still echoes through the halls of SeaWorld to this day. But was it enough? Or is there still more lurking beneath the surface, waiting to rise again? Tamarie Tollison nearly lost her life in a pool she once called home. But her story, buried behind headlines and sealed behind closed doors, still speaks volumes about the price of captivity and the cost of silence. If stories like Tamarie's matter to you, subscribe and share. We uncover the hidden truth behind orca attack stories the world forgets, because some voices still need to be heard. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.